Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We are diving into a topic that is getting a lot of attention, but also receiving a lot of confusion, which is employer value proposition or EVP. And not just what EVP is in theory, but how it actually shows up in your day to day operations, your hiring, your employee experience. So I'm very excited to be joined today by Nicole Carlson. Nicole brings 18 years of public sector experience and a perspective that I think that a lot of you are going to be able to relate to very well. So, Nicole, before we jump in, can you take a moment and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into HR?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'd just like to start off by saying I didn't necessarily take a traditional path into HR. I actually started as an emergency dispatcher. And so my first experience in public service was in operations, very fast paced and very focused on people and the citizens in the community. But from there, I transitioned to human resources as an administrative assistant. And I was fortunate enough to work my way up through a variety of HR roles, eventually leaving the organization as a director, where I was overseeing human resources, IT, and risk management. So I've seen the employee experience from a lot of different angles, not just human resources. And that's really shaped how I think about EVPs because I've lived what it feels like when things work in an organization and when they don't.
That's an incredibly valuable perspective. So, let's just start very simply. When you think about EVP, what does it actually mean to you? Give us a working definition.
Yeah, so to me, EVP means three different things. Why someone chooses to work for you, why they stay at your organization, and what they say about you when they leave or when they're talking to other people. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about an EVP is that it's something that you create, like a careers page or a mission statement. But the truth is, your EVP already exists. It's being shaped every single day by your processes, how your managers interact with your staff, how you communicate with your employees, and your systems within the organization. Your employees are constantly evaluating it and likely talking to people outside the organization about it as well.
Yeah, they probably are. So, what I hear is that it's less about what you say and it is more about what people are experiencing in their day to day.
Yeah, exactly. The research backs that up. There's a strong connection between how your EVP is aligned with the employee experience and the outcomes that it has, like retention and engagement. But most organizations haven't fully connected those dots yet.
Awesome. So hopefully we'll be able to connect a few of those dots today. But let's talk about this gap because we hear a lot about HR needs to evolve. When you think about that statement, what have you seen in terms of that shift being successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the difference is between HR being transactional and transformational, right? Early on in my career, HR was transactional. It was focused on processing paperwork and responding to emails or even reacting to issues as they came up. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's definitely necessary work in a human resources department. But over time, I think that organizations that stand out focus more on the transformational experience. They're starting to ask different questions about how do we create a better onboarding experience for employees, or how do we ensure that we're setting employees up for success that have been promoted internally. It's also about how can we help create psychological safety and trust within our work groups. That's transformational HR, and that's where EVPs live in that transformation.
So you've mentioned before a framework that simplifies all of this. Can you walk us through the EVP framework that you had in mind?
Yes, EVPs can feel big and abstract, but in practice, almost every challenge falls into three categories: people, purpose, and processes. And I use this all the time to help organizations diagnose things where they're breaking down.
Can you give us an example of that diagnosis?
Sure, so let's think about if an employee is frustrated, we might think that the person is the issue. But if we dig deeper, we might actually have an issue with a process. Or if we're struggling to recruit, it might not just be the pay. It could be the purpose or how we're communicating the position. So let's look at if an employee is frustrated, we might think that the person is the issue. But if we dig deeper, there might actually be a problem with the process. Or if we're struggling to recruit, it might not only be pay, it could be how we're communicating the position or the purpose of the position that we're including in our job posting. So our framework helps us get to a root cause.
Excellent. So let's start with the first on the list, which is people. What do you see most often here?
So I think this is where the experience really begins. What's interesting is that people problems don't show up labeled that way, right? They show up as candidates who are dropping out of our process, maybe new hires feel disconnected, and employees not knowing where to go for help. I remember early on helping an employee onboard. The employee showed up to work and there was no one ready there for them. No computer, no plan, no direction. And you could see that the excitement about their new position really dropped.
Yeah, that's not the first impression I think that any employer is after.
Absolutely not. And the research supports that a structured onboarding can improve retention by over 50%. So those early experiences shape how employees feel about your organization long term. And when we talk about EVP, it starts right there.
Excellent. So let's move on to the next P, which is process. And process is a big one because I think it happens to be the underlying problem, maybe even more often than people are the problem.
Absolutely. And it can often be underestimated. Processes is what our employees are interacting with every day. And when it's broken, they feel it immediately. I can give you an example. I went through a transition at my organization from paper timesheets to a digital timekeeping system. And on the surface, that can sound fairly simple, but it took almost 18 months to roll that out, going from the initial phases to going live,
18 months, like more than a year. That's
more than
crazy.
a year. It took 18 months, and not because of the technology. It was because we had decentralized practices that didn't align with existing policies. We spent a lot of time trying to determine how to best address the inconsistent practices that have been in place for years, and then rewrote the policies to align with our desired practices, retrained staff, and then shifted their mindsets. And that's something that I see a lot. Organizations think that they're implementing a system, but they're actually trying to transform a process.
And I'm sure that employees can feel that every single step of the way as they are being transformed along with the process and the technology that you're trying to bring in.
Yeah, absolutely. And research shows that that administrative burden can cause confusing processes or redundant steps, and that directly impacts employee satisfaction, their stress level, and their trust in management. So, if we're evaluating processes, we need to remember that it isn't just operational, it's emotional too.
So now I want to transition the conversation over to case management and start thinking about a better way of working. So you mentioned earlier that one of the big challenges that teams were facing was actually email. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. I think that one of the biggest opportunities I see is related to emails. A lot of HR teams are managing requests and processes through email. Things can get lost, things can be inconsistent or misinterpreted when responded to, and there's no visibility. So if you want to move to case management, it can change everything.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the big question in the room. How is case management going to be different than the management that you're doing via email today?
Yeah, absolutely. It creates structure. So employees know where to go, HR can track the request, and nothing falls through the cracks. So this is especially important for areas like family medical leave, workers' comp, and employee relations issues. I've even seen how much stress this can remove, not just for HR, but for employees too.
Excellent. So let's move on to talking a little bit about purpose, our next P. Um, Purpose is especially important in the public sector. So, how are we using purpose to create a competitive advantage in our space?
It's a great question. I think this is where public sector organizations have a huge advantage. Public sector might not always be able to compete with high salaries, but we can absolutely compete with purpose. Employees want to feel like their work matters, and in the public sector, it truly does.
But they don't always feel that way, at least at first glance. Is that true?
Yes, that's very true. And that's where the gap is. If an organization's job postings, onboarding, and internal messaging doesn't reinforce that the purpose exists, employees won't feel it. A lot of new hires and even current employees do not have a basic understanding of the services that their agency provides or the impact that it makes with the community. And research shows that meaningful work is one of the strongest drivers of engagement and retention. So it's not just a nice to have anymore, it's strategic.
Yeah, that's so excellent. I love, NEOGOV's internal purpose statement is to serve the people that serve the people. Um, and so we definitely feel that here. And I know all of our customers feel that way about their agencies and their organizations as well.
Absolutely.
Well,
There's a lot of pride in public service.
absolutely. All right. So let's talk about the recruiting conversation. How do you make EVP visible to candidates when they're going through the recruiting process?
Another great question. So this is where I've seen a lot of impact, especially if organizations are using tools like Attract and Insight. Um, First, we can start with rethinking our job posting. So instead of listing out job requirements that are formal and rigid, maybe the organization shifts to using more clear language or highlighting their total compensation package up front, or even explaining how the position impacts the community by sharing a description that represents a day in the life.
That's awesome and really gives you an idea of what the job may actually look like, which is great. So, have you seen things like sharing a description of the day in the life really make a big difference in the recruiting and talent acquisition process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime that we can inform our candidates about what's going on in the organization and how the position interacts with the community, that's a huge benefit. Also, using the NEOGOV tools to include a benefit summary or linking a video can really improve engagement. And again, at the end of the day, we're just helping the candidate truly understand the position and the value it's bringing to the community, because candidates are evaluating us just as much as we're evaluating them.
Absolutely. It's almost like dating. All right.
Absolutely.
Swiping right on NeoGov. So you mentioned earlier one thing that is very, very common in public sector is that we're not always able to compete on salary. So that's the subject I want to talk about next. Obviously, this is a reality for a lot of organizations. What happens when you can't compete on pay?
Yeah, absolutely. You've said it. This is very common for government organization and it comes up all the time. But helping the candidate truly understand their position and the value it brings to the community can set you apart. So my advice to organizations is focus on what you have. Public sector organizations typically offer really great benefits, very strong retirement or pension plans. They offer great work life balance with steady schedules and generous time off accruals. They offer great opportunities for career growth and then overall just stability in their role. But we're not always great at communicating that effectively.
Yeah, the stability one really sticks out for me, especially when you're in a time of some economic uncertainty. Playing up that stability in roles is a pretty big deal. But you said we don't always communicate it effectively. So, on that note, is this a visibility issue?
Yes, absolutely. I think that one great option that organizations could do is create a compensation calculator to help translate all of those benefits into a real value. When candidates can see the full picture, it can change the conversation. It's really great if we can help a candidate understand their total compensation package, not just their salary, and that will likely play a major role in their job choice.
Great. So now that we have covered bringing people in the door with excellent talent acquisition strategies through our employer value proposition, let's talk a little bit about overcoming resistance to change. And I am thinking like internal change within your agencies. What gets in the way of actually making improvements like this?
I think one of the biggest factors is fear of change. Organizations stay with paper processes or outdated systems because it feels familiar and comfortable, but often that familiarity comes at a cost.
Yeah, so I've actually heard some customers describing, getting over this change hurdle and telling me that their bosses have said things like, "Well, you can make that change when I retire," which I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah.
So that's certainly one kind of cost, but what other costs are we dealing with?
Yeah, I think the biggest ones are inefficiency and overall employee frustration. Research shows that resistance to change is often driven by uncertainty, not necessarily capability. So the goal isn't to push massive transformation overnight. We should really try to start small and do one process improvement at a time and have one win at a time.
All right, let's go ahead and close this out with EVP in action. Nicole, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. If you could leave everyone with one final thought, what would that be?
I would say that your EVP isn't something that you write, it's something that you build. And most organizations already have those pieces. So we want to make sure that we're aligning our people, our processes, and our purpose. And when we do that, we're not just improving human resources, we're improving our employees' overall well being, as well as how the organization serves the community. And that's the part that I'm most passionate about, helping public sector teams realize what's possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of your insights, Nicole. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat. For those of you who are listening, you can submit additional questions through the chat feature. We'll answer as many as we have time for today. And we will also be answering questions directly through the chat feature. If we don't get to your question, rest assured we will be following up via email after the presentation. So with that, let's transition into our Q&A. So first question that I have for you, Nicole, is where do most organizations get EVP wrong?
Yeah, I think that most organizations focus on EVP as a messaging exercise, like updating a careers page or rewriting job descriptions or even promoting their benefits. But the breakdown isn't actually what employees are saying, it's what they're experiencing. So if an employee is experiencing inconsistent onboarding or extremely manual processes, that disconnect shows up directly in recruiting and retention. Organizations that see the most success are the ones that treat their EVPs as an operational strategy, not as a branding effort.
Excellent. Next question here I have is if we can't compete on salary, back to the salary. This one must hurt, folks. If we can't compete on salary, what should I do?
Yeah, again, huge, very common challenge in the public sector, but this is again where the EVP matters most. You want to lean into what you do have and what you can offer those employees. So, again, you want to communicate your benefits and your retirement plan up front. When employees come into orientation and meet with HR or even their new supervisor, talk about the long term career paths that they can work towards. Talk about how your organization offers a very strong work life balance with steady schedules. And then also don't forget to talk about the mission driven work and how their job and their position contributes to your community. I think that's key to making the position's value visible and easy to understand, especially if we're talking about during the recruiting process. If candidates can't see the full picture, they'll default to comparing to salary alone.
Yes, too true. All right. So next one I have for you here is what is one area organizations can improve quickly?
Good question. I would say the biggest area that organizations can improve on is onboarding, and that's one that's very impactful. Even small changes like very clear communication or being prepared for an employee on their first day can significantly improve how employees feel about the organization. And those experiences set up expectations and influence whether someone wants to stay long term.
Great. Next question have here is, we've put an EVP strategy in place. How do I know if it's actually working?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think looking at your employee data will really help. So look at your data to see if your candidates have stopped dropping out of the process early on, or are you receiving feedback from new hires about onboarding and has that feedback turned into a more positive trend? Or talk about and look at if employees are getting frustrated or delayed in different processes. I think that if you're seeing inconsistency or friction in certain areas, that's where the EVP is breaking down. So we want to have our EVP working when the experience feels clear, consistent, and aligned with expectations.
Excellent. Last question that I think we have time for today is, where should organizations start if everything feels like a priority?
Yes, that's so true. There's so many problems to solve every single day. So I would say start small and start with one area where you think the impact will be the most visible, usually a high volume area or a high friction process. So that could be reevaluating your application experience or looking at your onboarding workflows or how your employees can request support. The goal isn't to fix everything at once, it's to help create momentum. If your employees and your candidates start to feel a smoother, more consistent experience, that's when EVP begins to strengthen in a meaningful way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure everybody here on the call enjoyed it as well. Again, if you have questions for Nicole, go ahead and submit those in the chat before we close out this meeting. We'll follow up via email, and we can't wait to catch you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.